everyone, thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Brodie Lancaster. I'll be hosting tonight's conversation with Meg Wolitzer. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as to any elders of other communities who are with us tonight. Meg Wolitzer, the woman sitting next to me, is the New York Times best-selling author of a dozen books, including The Interestings, The 10-Year Nap, and The Uncoupling. Her 2003 book, The Wife, was adapted into the film of the same name, for which Glenn Close was nominated for an Oscar and won a Golden Globe earlier this year. Her latest novel, The Female Persuasion, grapples with female power, intergenerational feminism, and the ways women's influence and idealism morph over time. Please join me in welcoming Meg Wolitzer. Thank you. I didn't run that bio by you. I hope that it was okay.
It was great, thank you.
Before we dive into The Female Persuasion, I'd really like to talk a little bit about The Second Shelf,
Sure.
The piece that you wrote for the New York Times in 2012. It was about, for anyone who doesn't know, it was about the different rules for literary fiction for men and women. And in it you say that stories about relationships and the interior lives of women are relegated to a lower shelf. At the time you wrote it, you'd been a published author for about 30 years. Had you felt in that time like your work had been in that literal or metaphorical place?
There were times I definitely did feel that way, yes. I felt sometimes that since some of the subject matter that I write about involves women, it seemed to be sort of treated as if it was only for women. One of the things that I talked about in the piece, and this didn't really apply to me per se, but was the difference in book covers. Sometimes you'd have a book by a man, or a book that with giant letters that sort of seemed to suggest this book is an event, and then a book by a woman that had what I jokingly called in the piece a cover called Little Girl in a Field of Wheat. And you cannot imagine two men, say, standing on a train platform, "Hey Bill, what's that you're reading? Little Girl in a Field of Wheat? Oh, I loved it. Did you read the sequel, Little Girl in a Field of Rye?" You know, it's not going to happen. So how are we, marketing books? Why are we drawing men away from books, say, about women or by women? Somebody did, I don't know if I can call it a study, but I saw somebody sort of looked at books that had won prizes and saw that very few of them were from a female perspective. So it's not only who writes the books. It's an ongoing thing. But I did feel at times that I was treated like women's fiction. Yeah.
And you said something around the time that the 10-Year Nap came out, that you were writing about what you were observing in your life in the same way that like a war reporter writes about what they're observing, but that the idea is that women's and children's lives aren't big and important enough to warrant like serious literary attention. Were you ever made to feel whether when you were a student or later on in your career that you would need to either change your approach to get that serious literary attention, or that you just had to kind of go with what you were passionate about and accept that the industry was not on your side?
Well, I've had a career and I've had real readers. So, but I think I did really see that there was a difference in topics. I mean, in the 10-Year Nap, it involves women who, after their children are born, stop working, and then 10 years pass, and they're trying to think about what to do with their lives. And that one thing in that book, like nobody worked, so nobody could be judged in that quick way. And I talked to a lot of mothers who found themselves judged in a very, very deep way. I actually once was at a party, and I put this in that piece, The Second Shelf, and I met a man who heard I was a writer, and he asked me what I write about, and I sort of said, well, marriage, sexuality, children, family, gender, and his eyes were sort of rolling up in his head as he was standing there, and finally he said to me, "Oh, you should talk to my wife, she'd be interested in this," and he scurried off as fast as he could. Why? I mean, you almost feel sometimes when you're trying to sort of defend or explain your little book, like the lines to Beast of Burden, ain't I rich enough, ain't I rough enough, like what do I have to do? There's also, but you can't.
But the Bette Midler version, right?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. With a chaser of the rose. Yes, without a doubt.
I have to imagine that the things you wrote in that piece were pulled from thoughts you were having, but also, I imagine, conversations you were having with other women writers. Did the publication of that essay and the response to it, it had an enormous response, did that affect your intentions or your goals or motivations for the work you did afterwards?
Well, I think it's always good to articulate what's burning you up in some way. What are you thinking about all the time? I mean, even actually when it comes to writing, I always feel, people say to writers, write what you know. I always think it's write what obsesses you. In my case, though, if you really want to know what obsesses you, there's a horrible way that nobody would want to do. Look at everything you've Googled for the past 24 hours. It's horrifying. For me, it would be a combination of Virginia Woolf and Does This Mole Look Suspicious, which is not going to make a good novel.
I mean, I'd read it.
Thank you. I'm picturing now the giant mole on the cover, and I don't know.
But in a field of wheat.
In a field of wheat. Yes.
So you closed that piece by asking, among other things, will more literary women be able to persuade their publishers to keep the woman in a field of wheat photo off the cover and replace it with a bold typeface and a neutral illustration, which is a great segue into the female persuasion. Female persuasion? The female persuasion, you couldn't get a bolder cover than this. And this is it's an impactful book in its size and the way it looks. Maybe let's start by, should we ask a question or should we do the reading first? Maybe I'll ask my question. Going into this, what was obsessing you? What were the things that you wanted to do narratively, but also in the way that this book is marketed? It's marketed like an event book, as you wrote in the second shelf.
I was thinking a lot about a few things. I was thinking about female power, and I was thinking about how we make meaning in our lives, and also, specifically also about the person you might meet when you're young who sees something in you and sort of changes your life in some way. And all of those together, I kind of held them, sort of put them on the stickies in my brain as I just started writing, not really knowing where I was going to go.
Do we want to read a little from the person in the book who had a profound impact on the life of your main character, Greer?
Yeah, I'll just give you a little sort of setup here. I always feel when I'm reading a little bit from my book that it's sort of like I'm giving you an amuse-bouche in a restaurant, something with sun-dried tomatoes on it. So my protagonist's name is Greer Kadetsky, and she is in her first year of college in 2006, and she goes to a frat party, and she's groped by a frat brother, and her face goes very hot. She's a shy person, and she has this feeling after it happens. She doesn't know, was I assaulted? Or am I making too much of this? Should I just shut up about it? Did a real thing happen? And she doesn't really know the answer, and she doesn't know how to articulate it to herself. And then sometime later, the famous feminist Faith Frank, how's that for an alliteration, comes to speak on her campus. And Faith is kind of described as 2 or 3 steps down in fame from Gloria Steinem. And she became famous in the 1970s, early 1970s, for her magazine, Bloomer magazine, that was also 2 steps down from his magazine. And she's sort of sexy and wears trademark boots, is 63 years old now, and on the college lecture circuit as the magazine has become as thin as the manual to a small appliance. So Greer goes to hear Faith speak in the chapel to kind of try to have a connection with her, to ask her, what should I do about this feeling that I have, this feeling I'm starting to have about being female in the world? So here's a little section from that. At the podium, Faith said, whenever I give a talk at colleges, I meet young women who say, I'm not a feminist, but, by which they mean, I don't call myself a feminist, but I want equal pay, and I want to have equal relationships with men, and of course I want to have an equal right to sexual pleasure. I want to have a fair and good life. I don't want to be held back because I'm a woman. Later, Greer understood that what Faith had actually said in her speech was only one part of the whole effect. Really, it was about more than her words. What also mattered was that it was her speaking them, meaning them, conveying them with such feeling to everyone in this room. And I always want to reply, said Faith, What do you think feminism is other than that? How do you think you're going to get those things if you deny the political movement that is all about obtaining that life that you want? She stopped for a moment, and they all thought about this, some of them surely thinking about themselves. They watched her take a slow and deliberate drink of water, which was somehow, Greer realized, highly interesting. To me, Faith continued, there are two aspects to feminism. The first is individualism, which is that I get to shape my own life, that I don't have to fit into a stereotype, doing what my mother tells me, conforming to someone else's idea of what a woman is. But there's a second aspect too, and here I want to use the old-fashioned word sisterhood, which may make you groan a little and head for the exits in a stampede, but I'll just have to take that chance. There was laughter. They were all listening. They were all with her now, and they wanted her to know it. Sisterhood, she said, is about being together with other women in a cause that allows all women to make the individual choices they want. Because as long as women are separate from one another, organized around competition, like in a children's game, where only one person gets to be the princess, then it will be the rare woman who is not in the end narrowed and limited by our society's idea of what a woman should be. She stopped again and looked out across the whole room, sweeping her gaze over them. So the next time you say, I'm not a feminist, remember all of this and do what you can to join the fight, which is ongoing. She paused. Oh, and here's a final thought. Along the way, as you're fighting for what matters, you will definitely come up against resistance, and that can be upsetting and even throw you off course. The truth is, not everyone is going to agree with you. Not everyone is going to like you or love you. That's right. Some people will be really mad at you and maybe even hate you, and that is going to be hard to accept. But my feeling is that if you're out there doing what matters, if it's any consolation, I love you. She smiled a brief, encouraging smile at them, and that was it. Greer folded. She was taken in, completely taken up, wanting more of this forever. Faith had made her little joke about loving them, but as Greer listened to Faith, what she herself felt seemed closely related to falling in love. Greer knew all about falling in love, the way discovering Corey had shaken her around, messed with her cells. This was like that, but without the physical desire. The sensation wasn't sexual, but the word love still seemed relevant here, love which pollinated the air around Faith Frank. Surely other people here felt it too, didn't they? And even if they'd been in a teenage stupor for years, staring at themselves in every reflective surface, frowning at their image as they popped a pimple with a little splat of greenish milk against glass, and railing to friends about their dumbass parents, or being forced to come to the chapel on this night despite being the kind of people Faith had described, who blithely went around saying they weren't feminists. Now a revelatory gong had been struck inside them. It vibrated and seemed like it would never stop. For here was this new, formidable person speaking in such an exciting way about their place in the looming, disturbing world, making them want to be more than they were. Faith said, okay, well, I think I've just about run out of things to tell you. I'm going to be quiet now and give the rest of you a chance to talk. Thank you so much for listening. The room erupted with appreciative clapping, as loud as if an object had been dropped into a pan of hot oil from a great height. Greer immediately began clapping. Someone in the back called out, Faith, you rock! And someone else shouted, effing awesome boots, which made Faith Frank laugh. Of course she had a great laugh. The head went back and the mouth opened, the gullet exposed as if she were a sleek and elegant seal about to swallow a fish. The chapel was warmed a few degrees by human heat and excitement, and it smelled even more strongly of people and their wet jackets. The whole place was ripening. Faith looked out over the crowd and hands went up. There was a dull, boilerplate question, do you have a message for the young people of today? And then a hokey question that required Faith to assemble her dream dinner party. There were no restrictions on the country that the person was from or what century. So what people would you choose? Greer remembered later that Faith had chosen Amelia Bloomer, the namesake of her magazine, and the hot young singer Opus, who had recently played the Super Bowl halftime show, also the Italian Baroque painter Artemisia Gentileschi, the aviatrix Bessie Coleman, who was the first African-American woman to hold a pilot's license, Dorothy Parker, both Hepburns, Audrey and Catherine, because I like their style. And finally, to liven things up, let's throw in a couple of ardent anti-feminists, said Faith, although I might be tempted to spit in their food. It all blew by quickly because Greer had been distracted at the time, thinking that if she herself threw a dinner party, the main person she would want to invite was Faith Frank. She suddenly imagined Faith sitting comfortably in the woolly dormitory first-floor lounge in her cool, tall boots, eating a bowl of instant ramen that Greer would have prepared for her in the microwave. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Just some inspiration for our Q&A later.
Yes.
So after that comes the moment when, spoiler alert, Greer learns to kind of use her voice, which becomes a theme for her throughout the book. Can you tell me a little about her character specifically? The book is really, we divert and kind of spend a lot of time with all the characters in her life, but she's really the focal point. What had you observed in women her age who are encountering feminism or grappling with it that you wanted to kind of pin this novel around?
Well, I remembered myself. I mean, I'm not her. I don't like writing autobiographically. I don't think I ever really do. But I remember that hot-faced part of myself and not really being able to articulate what I felt. When I was 14, a few friends and I formed a consciousness-raising group. You know about those in Australia? I feel like when I say those words now, I'm kind of, it sounds like I'm saying the words butter churn, something so old, something so from the past. But it was really important for me and my friends. We wrote away, actually, to the National Organization for Women for a list of topics. And they sent us a brochure with topics like orgasm and you. And we wanted things like when your mom won't listen. But I remember coming into the world and not really knowing what I was doing. And I don't have daughters, I have sons, but I've seen a lot of this generation. And in fact, I would always kind of, when I would call my editor, I would keep the assistant on the phone a little too long. You know, hey, you know, before you turn me over to my editor, when you were in college, what kind of a feminist would you say you were? Okay, thank you. You know, I would sort of get what I could from a lot of people. And it's changed. There's so many answers. There's so many ways of being a feminist. You know, there's, you know, second wave, there's younger women, but not everyone ascribes to one way of being.
I feel like now consciousness raising is like putting quotes on Instagram.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
About like body positivity or something.
Right, but it's a consciousness-raising group of like, you know, thousands.
Yeah.
Whereas we had a bowl of Lipton onion dip, and I don't think you could really do that.
So the book's kind of core issues of female power, feminism, misogyny, you've said before, are things that you've been thinking about for your entire adult life. And I know I related to them. I'm sure most, if not all, of your women readers related to that. We just heard Greer's formative feminist moment, and Faith's comes later in the book. Do you remember the conscious moments or events that sparked your feminism in the ways that it did for your characters?
One thing that really affected me a lot is my mother. So my mother is 89 and totally great, and she's a novelist named Meg Wolitzer. And she didn't go to college. Her parents didn't think it was important for girls to go to college, young women to go to college. But she wanted to write. And she grew up in a house without books, really. The big book that they had in her apartment in Brooklyn was something called Dr. Morris Fishbein's Home Medical Encyclopedia. And she, as she said, she became kind of an informed hypochondriac. But she had this thing in her that you can't really teach someone. And in my novel, The Interestings, when I talk a little bit about different kinds of talent. She had this innate talent. And I saw her struggling. And when her book came out, her first novel in 1974, one of the reviews said, "Housewife turns into novelist." The condescension of that. I mean, she's joked that it was as if she were Clark Kent kind of going into a phone booth, and now I'm a novelist. Like a woman could not become a writer. And I started to see that difference. And some of that I did use in The Wife when I wrote it much later. I think seeing that in my mother, and seeing how hard she worked, but how there was, you know, a review like that could have condescension, sort of struck me in the back of my brain.
When you pursued a career as a writer, you were still a student.
Yep.
Were you conscious of kind of not necessarily following in your mother's footsteps, but like kind of going down the same path as she went down, and how those paths like diverged or were similar?
Well, you know, she was 44 when her book came out. I was 22. We joked that my grandmother was going to be 88, but that didn't happen. I think really because she had started so late and regretted that, I think that's part of why I started so early. I think, as a way to sort of not have to feel that kind of regret. I think, everyone's path is tremendously different. When I sold my first novel to Random House for $5,000. And I thought the money was going to last a really long time, and I'm almost out now. But I remember actually going to the Random House building, and feeling like that hot-faced Greerishness, and getting on the elevator for the first time to meet my editor. And I had my box of my manuscript. I'd sold it. And you remember copy places where we used to go and copy things? Yeah. And I got on with my little copy box, and a priest got on. My manuscript was like this high. He got on with his manuscript. He didn't have a box. It was like this high. And it was all bound up with the kind of rope you use on a boat. And he looked at me and he said, "Do they know you're coming?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "They don't know I'm coming." And I feel, in a way, there was something in his assertiveness that I lacked, in this sort of male assertiveness that I lacked. And I didn't know to sort of, I certainly wasn't a diva. And I didn't know to ask for what I might want or anything. I sort of said everything was great. It was a way in, and I'm glad I did it. I don't go back and read things too much, but I found my way.
They don't know I'm coming is so ominous.
It's sort of a metaphor, too, for writers. I mean, I have a whole spiel, really, for another panel, another day, about fiction in a nonfiction world, and the idea that really they may know we're coming, but they may feel ambivalent about it, really. What does fiction give you? It's something I care about a lot.
Yeah. I remember in the second shelf you listed some women writers who came up during the women's movement when you said stories about women's lives suddenly mattered to the cultural conversation.
Yeah.
I feel like we're in a similar climate now, but I also know that I came up writing for the internet, and so I don't have a whole lot to compare it to before then. I'm wondering what you make of the writing world, both online and in traditional publishing, when it comes to people's willingness to listen to women's voices now?
It's a real mix. Do you find that? I think that the internet can be so shockingly hostile and ugly and aggressive. On the other hand, there are real pockets of feminism. So I think, like everything, it's a tremendous, enormous mix. I don't really know what to make of it. Do you?
I almost feel like the kind of personal, first-person essay culture, for lack of a better word, on the internet has kind of meant that, and that's like an area that women really thrive in and get opportunities to write in, but it often feels at the expense of writing about like the hardest or like darkest, almost traumatic parts of ourselves for consumption. And then I imagine it has an effect on fiction where people think everything a woman writes is somehow about their lives secretly or something.
Yeah, because women do get asked a lot about the autobiographical nature of stuff. Yeah.
So I don't know what to make of it either. I've had a lot of thoughts about it. It's all in a doc on my computer.
Obviously, I grew up, like my mother, because I would watch my mother writing when I went to school in the morning. Having a writer for a parent. You'd think that the children of writers are so happy that their mother or father does something creative, but that isn't really the case. And I remember sort of looking at my mother, why can't you be a travel agent like Bonnie Goldstein's mother? But there she was in her bathrobe and with her little bottle of whiteout, little liquid paper. It's like doing scrimshaw, like a craft from the past. But I think in a way, there's a closeness and an intimacy with the page. In fact, my children, actually, I thought, my children in my generation would think differently about having, I think mostly they are proud, but I remember when my son was really young, we were walking in New York and we passed a McDonald's and there was a big sign that said, "Now hiring." And he went, "Mom, look." I did that. So all of that is by way of saying, I think that for me, I've always just tried to write the things that I am passionate about. And maybe I've been a little bit like Candide, kind of going along, not, even if the world doesn't catch up with you. It took a long time before I had a book that sold really well. But I was it was what I wanted to do. I was so happy that they were paying me to do something that I would have done anyway, that I didn't notice that maybe the world wasn't with me yet, you know?
On that idea of watching your mother's very particular way of working, what is your, like, do you have a routine? Are you like a furious, like, what would your kids see of your writing life? Are they seeing you like scribbling on everything, or are you like only computers?
Yeah, I'm pretty much only computers now. I really would be like, well, they're different phases. I mean, I sort of have something that I jokingly call my 80-page plan, and I'm happy to share it with you for a small fee. But I think that when you think about, you know, what you're writing about, like in the case of the Female Persuasion, I told you what I was thinking about. In the case of my novel, The Interestings, I was interested in what happens to talent over time, and also the kind of quiet envy you might feel for people you love. And in my novel, The Wife, it was sort of about male power and female complicity. And that's all I might know. And then I'll sit and I'll write without worrying, what is it? Are people going to like it? Will it get published? Where is it going? And I'll try to write 80 pages. And I say 80 pages because I think that's enough to feel like you've accomplished something, but it's not so much that if you put it aside, you'll feel absolutely terrible. And then once I get to 80 pages, I print it out. And here's a tip: are some of you writers here tonight? Well, I can't see if you are.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Good.
I'm assuming.
I always feel like people don't want to say that they're writers because they feel like they're going to run into people later. And Sue, I heard you said you were a writer. I haven't seen anything of yours in print.
It's very like exposing. Yeah,
I know. No, it is. But I will at that point print it out. And here, the tip is, print it out in a different font. It'll be like a new book. I'm telling you, it's incredible. Ooh, Palatino, this is cool. That old Courier, screw that. No, this is like...
Do it in papyrus, and it's like from another century.
Right, like a scroll, I know. My book has a kind of medieval tang. I'm doing it in illuminated manuscript, yeah. But I'll print it out, and I'll go sit somewhere. And now is the moment that what my children might see me either, at home typing furiously or out of the house, not at home. And I start to reckon not with the book that I thought I was writing, but the book, in fact, that I did write. And I think there's a great difference because I feel like every novel is kind of a grandiose fantasy. We have these ideas like those, female power, male power, whatever it is, envy. And then you see what you really did right, and you make there's a grief in a way. There's a grief around that. The idea of what I wrote is not necessarily as bold as I wanted, but you start to change it. Now you can really take a pen to it and cross things out and save yourself from absolute shame, and start creating the book, and the book that it is. And at that point, I might sort of make an outline. I may never look at it. I think outlines are kind of like an EpiPen. You may never use it, but it's good to know you have it. And then I go through the rest of the book pretty much that way. So they'll see me either at home in my bathrobe or sort of not at home writing.
Yeah. Did your 80 pages for The Female Persuasion make it into the book anywhere? Or was,
yeah. I always write chronologically. Start from the start of the book. Yeah.
Wow.
It did. It was the opening, really. I mean, it had a paragraph that didn't make it. A first paragraph, a kind of lofty paragraph about mentors and proteges that I thought was the horrible thing that we say in writing workshops, telling, not showing, and I took it out. Yeah.
There was the part in your book that it gave me that picture of Greer immediately, which was like her blue, like a bit of blue in her hair that I think it's like suggests boldness or has like a hint of the person she wanted to be. You like know that person as soon as she arises. And I'm just quoting your book back to you. I'm probably misquoting. Anyway.
Tell me more. What did I say?
So I'm glad you brought up the interestings, because when I was preparing for tonight and thinking about the themes that run through your work that I connect to, I kept coming back to that idea of talent and idealism in young people, which Greer and her friends definitely have, that depending on your circumstances and who you meet in your life can either be really galvanized in the way that Greer's was or kind of get dulled over time, like her boyfriend Corey's did a little. When you think of meeting someone when you were young who kind of changed or affected the course of your life, who comes to mind for you?
I had a few. In fact, I dedicated the book to 8 women who really were really important to me when I was young. But a few, and one who's not on that list, I had a teacher in first grade, or as you say, grade 1, right? Do you say that here? Who used to invite me up to her desk to dictate stories because my handwriting was so bad, but she knew that I liked to, write. And she was sort of like my secretary, and I was kind of like an executive. Take a letter, I was sort of like that. And the stories, my mother saved some, they were about things I knew nothing about, astronauts. There was one about 2 truckers, and the dialogue went, "Get up on the rig, Mac." I think...
You'd seen a hat?
I'd seen a Mac truck or a Mac hat, and I conflated the two. I know. But I think we start writing, finding a way to approximate the world, really, to enter the world. My mother, as I said, and much, much later on, I would say the writer and director Nora Ephron was somebody really, really important to me. The first film she directed was based on a book of mine, This Is My Life, and it was about a stand-up comic and her 2 daughters with Julie Kavner. And I think one of the things that I got from Nora, in addition to that great generosity and friendship, was a sense that being funny is serious business. And it's something that I thought about that recently, in fact, when I was finishing this book, because there's a moment in the book that I would have liked to show Nora, because I think it came from a sort of the kind of conversations we had about humor. Greer, because she's so shy when she's a little girl, is left alone in the classroom with the weird girl, sort of by default. And she's sitting beneath the whiteboard eating Pringles with the weird girl in class. And the weird girl says to her, "Do you ever think about poisoning our teacher?" And Greer says, "No." And the weird girl says, "Yeah, neither do I." And I feel like that it comes out of humor. I mean, it's a throwaway. Yeah. She never reappears, except my next book is called The Weird Girl. She doesn't reappear, but I think that humor, not being punchlines, is a way in fiction to expand and sort of fortify the moment, so you know who she is. You can't just say she was a shy girl or her face got hot. You can only say that so many times. 87, in fact. But this is a way to give her another character who just does this little walk-on. And I think that's the kind of thing Nora, the humor, particularly in her essays, really just came from little starbursts coming from somewhere. It has a freedom attached to it, and I think I definitely got that from her.
And the observation is such a big part of it. It's the idea of like, I've noticed something about this person, and it's funny to me in a way that I'm going to describe. And it's like that thing, I forget if it was like Tina Fey or Amy Poehler or someone who said like, A, B, C, D isn't funny if you set up at A and then you go straight to D and everyone's surprised by what came in the middle. No. Speaking of being funny in your books, I actually have a question about this because I was thinking about Joan in The Wife, who, and is that your only book written in the first person?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
The tone of that book is...
I have a middle grade, a children's book that I co-wrote with my friend Holly Goldberg Sloan called To Night Owl from Dogfish that just came out, in fact, and it's an epistolary novel, and it's mostly in emails in first person. But other than that, no.
Can you tell me a little bit about your relationship to comedy in your writing? I guess you just did a little in your relationship to Nora as well, but I'm wondering if it took time to be confident that you could be both taken seriously and be funny?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I have a few things to say about that. I mean, I feel like I sometimes find writers, like I teach writing a bit, and I'll find a writer who might be a certain way in life, and when they write, they only are writing with a certain kind of hushed reverence. And I wonder, that's a choice. You don't have to be who you are in person. I mean, particularly if you're not writing autobiographically. But I kind of wonder, I always think, who are you? Like the people who know you best, say your friends who really love you and know you, who are you to them? And if none of that appears on the page, I wonder why. There's a great line by Zadie Smith. She said, "When I write, I'm trying to express my way of being in the world." So I kind of think that it's about your way of being in the world, which might, in fact, include humor. but it's not necessarily humor like a joke. Like, okay, like here's a difference. I'll tell you a quick joke. It was an old woman's 100th birthday, and her family gathered around her in the nursing home, and they said, "Grandma, you're 100 years old. It's extraordinary. We're so happy for you. Is there anything you've always wanted to do your whole life but never had a chance to do?" And she said, "Well, there is one thing. All my life I've wanted to go whitewater rafting on the Colorado River." And they thought, all right, well, we did ask her. So they had her fitted for a special little helmet, and they had an IV pole, and they had a blood pressure cuff attached, and they hired a private nurse, and she was airlifted from the nursing home, and she was transported by helicopter across the country, slowly, gently lowered onto a raft with the nurse taking her pulse and her blood pressure. And it was fantastic. And then she was lifted back up, taken to the nursing home, and it was amazing. A year passed, and she was still alive. And they gathered again, and they said, "Grandma, you're 101. Is there anything you've always wanted to do your whole life and never had a chance?" And she said, "Well, there is one thing. All my life, I've wanted to go whitewater rafting on the Colorado River." Now, here's the thing. That joke, when I put in those details, weren't you like children picturing them? Like, right? Like, you're like dutiful. That's what we do with story. You're dutifully listening to the IV pole and the blood pressure cuff, and you're picturing it. But all of those details that I put in were there just so that I could whisk them away. In fiction, if that happens, you feel really cheated when that happens in fiction. The details are there as a sort of accretion, the way, like, like in the Iliad, you might have like a list and a catalog of things. They're there to sort of fortify and sort of give nutrition, in a sense, to the story. They're to make it more. The details are there to be piled up, not to be used to sort of exploit the reader or trick the reader in any way. So I think the humor that comes about in fiction can come in so many ways, but it often comes through who these people are. Somebody said that what we remember of the books we love isn't plot but character, and I tend to think, for me, that is true.
Something I loved about The Interestings was also, it's been a little while since I read it, but I remember really vividly the way you described the characters through one another's eyes, and versus like you could kind of get a sense that the way they thought of themselves, because in that teenagery way where you think you're putting on this kind of performance of yourself versus what everyone else sees in you, and there's so much humor in that like middle ground.
Yeah, it's so much about so I don't know if some of you have read the book. Have some of you read the book? Yes, I'm gonna have to ask the rest of you to leave. This is just between us.
Extremely inappropriate.
I did go to a summer camp. The book is about what happens to talent over time, and I did go to a summer camp. The book starts at a summer camp, and I wanted to act that one summer of my life, but I was really, really bad. Regardless of what kind of play I was in, it could be, Fiddler on the Roof or a Samuel Beckett play. I spoke in what I can only call my Katharine Hepburn voice. "Mother, where are you? Where are you, Mother?" It was just terrible, but I loved it there. I was so pretentious that summer. I had a diary because I thought, what if I became like a famous writer someday, and like the Bloomsbury set, and they wanted to read my diary. So I started all that year. I was keeping a diary. Like, "Tonight I watched Bewitched." It was like that. And then I forgot to write in my diary because I was having such a good time that I was like, oh no, I didn't write in it for weeks. I went back. This is totally true. On every page I wrote, "Nothing happened. Nothing happened." But I met these kids, and they were wonderful, and they were so exciting to me. They were more sophisticated than I was. They lived in New York City. I didn't even really know people lived in New York City. I just thought it was just, skyscrapers, and that's all I took, and I just started writing from there. And I think that when you have different characters looking at one another, there's an interesting geometry. You can really go back and forth. It's not just sort of somebody thinking about herself while she looks into a mirror. "Oh, mirror, I wish I," you don't have to do any of that.
Yeah. So speaking of that idea of someone looking in the mirror and narrating their, what they're thinking and feeling, I want to go back to that idea of the wife, or not the idea, the fact that The Wife was your first book written in the first person. And I would like to know what about that story made you approach it in that way, where you haven't done it in your other books, but also what then that process was like, seeing it made into a film where you're not getting a constant voiceover narration, and how you took the adaptation.
So, I was writing back to sort of the kind of hot-faced girl I was. I felt when I wrote The Wife that up until that point, I wasn't writing the books that I like to read. And I was sort of frustrated by it. And I went out, actually, I was in Paris visiting my closest friend who I met at the camp that I went to, Martha Parker. And Martha and her husband, who is Adam Gopnik, the writer, we had lunch in Paris, and I sort of confessed this to them. And we started talking about, like, if not now, when? Like, why not write with your full self in a way? And they were very encouraging to me in a way that I got a lot from. And I went home and I realized that it wasn't only about being afraid to be funny, but it's also about being afraid to be angry. So I wanted to write this funny, angry book about the wife of a big, bloated male novelist who wins a big prize, and it's just too much for the long-suffering wife. But if I did it in third person, it just already would have almost like it was separated by a by like a plate glass window. She looked across the room at her husband. It had that quality. Whereas this was started with, the first line is something like, the moment I decided to leave him, the moment I said enough, the moment I thought enough, blah, blah, blah. And I could let her be funny and really let him have it without telling it to him yet. So when the film took 14 years to get made, and it pretty much took that long because they could not find an American actor who was willing to play a total jerk in a movie called The Wife. I mean, it was like a double wound. He had to be a jerk, but also be overshadowed. It was too much. So, the screenwriter Jane Anderson stayed with it from the start. She was with it from the start. And finally, it got made with Glenn Close and Jonathan Pryce, who I thought were really, really wonderful. I actually wrote an essay for the New York Times Book Review about seeing my character made into, played by Glenn. And the thing is, like, when I write novels, I don't know how it is for most writers, but I don't see their actual facial features. They're kind of blurry the way people are sort of on a reality TV show when they don't want to be filmed, in the background. I mean, they're blurry, but we have a sense of them. Now forever, I would have the feeling of Glenn Close. But the thing that I said in this piece, and the thing that is really true, if some of you saw the film, maybe you agree, it's everything in the book. It's so much about her voice. In the film, it's about her face. And that's a real difference. And I love the kind of relay race, baton passing quality. If you have your book made into a film, you're kind of saying, go with God, because they're going to sort of do it their way. And you have to sort of allow them to do it their way. And I had this Swedish director and some Swedish Scandinavian funding. I mean, imagine growing up on Long Island as a little girl, someday Glenn Close will play your character in a Swedish film. It's like, no, what? No, that wasn't something I ever imagined. But I love it. I was really thrilled with it. And talking to Glenn and getting to know her has been really one of the lovely parts of it too.
As a kid, the only time I ever wrote fiction was because I wanted like an actor that I liked.
Oh, really?
I was like, how am I going to meet this actor? I'm going to write a book that'll get turned into a movie, and then he'll play someone in the movie.
That is clever. I actually, as a child...
It didn't work.
As a child... I wanted to marry one of the monkeys, but I had a really smart idea. I was going after Mickey Dolenz because I figured I could never get Davy Jones. So I was really smart. This way, I had a shot.
He'd come over for dinner sometimes.
Yeah. He'd come over, and he'd be like, "No one loves me; they all love Davy." Yeah. So I will go out with you, 7-year-old girl. No, right? It's horrifying. No.
So circling back to the Female Persuasion for a second, as much as there is some hope in the book, a feeling that it captured really well, I thought, was the idea of like the cyclical nature of feminist progress. Things getting a bit better and then regressing and then maybe improving again a little. And there's like a scene where Faith, in her like remembrance of her career, is brought on like a chat show in the 70s with like a misogynist comedian for like under the guise of a debate, which I thought our generation invented, that kind of horror of forcing a woman to be confronted by a misogynist on TV. Did writing this book and the themes you focused on make you feel hopeful or discouraged, or some combination of the two?
I think a combination. I mean, so I started writing this. I started writing this book like 4 years ago, I guess, and I kept getting asked when the book came out in April last year, did you start writing it after Me Too began? It's like, what? I would have had to have, hired a lot of people to go into a room and we all would have taken a chapter.
Yeah.
But these are old ideas, they really, really are. And it can be depressing. On the other hand, articulating things is not depressing. I feel also like when I'm writing, there's so much anxiety to feel every day in the world, in the news, in our lives, that kind of nonfiction quality to the world. When I write, when I'm kind of trying to figure something out, I do feel a weird encouragement. I do. And it doesn't mean that I think the world is any better, but I think it's a complicated thing with feminism. I finished the book right before the 2016 election, and it ended sort of like one chapter sooner. And then I was kind of pacing the house, and I asked my editor if I had time to kind of go back into the book and add a sort of coda that kind of thrust the characters ahead a bit into the future. Because it wasn't only, as you say, that things are going to be a little better or a little worse, but what if the whole thing is, in fact, yanked away from you like the tablecloth in that magic trick? What about that? But then, as I was thinking about that, there was this nascent movement of women flooding politics and this new ideas around rage and feminism. I went to the Women's March in Washington, and I felt better. I kind of felt better for a little while. It has a bit of a half-life. I guess I feel, you can despair, but you can talk about things. In a way, I'm surprised that we're still talking about these things. When I was a kid, seeing my mother and her, feminist friends talk about things, I kind of thought everything would be solved by the time I grew up. And, newsflash, it really has not. But I'm not hopeful about that per se, but I think maybe I look at it differently now. Maybe it's not about the results that we're going to see. We're part of something. We're part of this long chain. And I feel much more of that now, in a way. And all I do as a novelist is not try to sort of, I'm not trying to predict. I'm trying to say, what is it like? What is it like? That's really my mantra again and again. What is it like? Novels are a kind of snapshot of a moment in time. They're sort of like an advent calendar. There are a lot of doors that you can go in to a novel. But I want to go, what is it like for these people? I'm not trying to say this happy ending or not, but just look at it.
What are the things that are obsessing you now that you want to kind of get your 80 pages down and then see where that takes you for your next book?
I'm starting to write. I'm starting to take notes. I lost a lot of time this year because I did a lot of publicity for the Female Persuasion, and then the movie came out, and I did a bunch of things.
You went to the Oscars, right?
Yes, I did. I went to the Oscars. It was fabulous until it was sad. But I will say this. Did you know that there's an open bar at the Oscars?
I thought the Globes was the really drunk one.
Yeah, no, it's not drunk. It's not drunk, but you can... No, but beforehand, it's like a party, and you can go back to the bar, but you'll get shut out until the next commercial, so you don't want to do that. But you also have to walk the red carpet even if no one is looking at you. No, it's still fun. It's okay. It's okay. I love this. This is like my consciousness raising group. Thank you.
We're all empathizing with you.
Yeah, I did go to the Oscars. It was an exciting year to have your book turned into a film. It is like. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At the big, like our version of the Grammys, which is like kind of a joke because it's very low scale compared. But in the audience, they have a bunch of seats, and then in the middle, they've just turned one into like an esky or a cooler filled with wine.
Really?
So that no one, because one year they told everyone you can't drink during the ceremony, and then everyone just left the room and there was no audience.
Oh,
because
wow. No.
You take away wine and the Australian music industry is not happy. Do we have any questions?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Okay, great.
All Right, I'm going to break the seal on the audience questions, so maybe there'll be some more after me. So thanks, Meg, for your books. The first one I was ever introduced to was The Interestings, and the issues we've already mentioned that really resonated, quiet envy, and also the, inflated ambitions and expectations that we have for our future, and how important we're going to be in it was really hit home to me. The main character in the book, Jules, obviously finds herself in adulthood struggling with a sense of mediocrity amidst all of these really talented friends, which ultimately doesn't really resolve tangibly in the book by the finish. Maybe her perspective does, but I guess as a reader who sort of resonates with sort of finding yourself kind of dime a dozen in this world. What's sort of the consolation for the Jules characters?
Well, I think that we inflate the notion of specialness, right? I mean, it's just so horrifying that everybody has to be special and gifted and the whole thing. I mean, what is the point of life? I do try to explore that a bit. I was very affected. I don't know if any of you saw the Michael Apted films, the 7 Up, 28 Up documentaries. Oh, yeah. They're so amazing. I think they're on Netflix, at least in the US. He followed a group of British school children and filmed them every 7 years. And there was this girl, Susan or Susie, and it's often really about class. And she was very posh. And when she was 7, she was like, I don't care for that. And then in 28 Up, her father dies. I think it was 28 Up. And I liked her from then on because I think that her character showed, I don't know, I mean, how we affect people. One of the things in the Female Persuasion, in fact, there's a sort of fight, an argument between two friends, and my protagonist, little shy Greer, betrays her friend in a big way. And her friend says, I feel like there's two kinds of feminists, the famous ones and everyone else. And I almost feel in a way that there's flashy people and maybe everyone else. And I think that the emphasis on flash has made people have a distorted view of what a decent and reasonable kind of life is. So live it up. Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
You've mentioned a couple of times sort of the different age ranges that your books cover and that you've written for young adults as well, so middle grade children. How much do you consider the audience of each of your books, mainly for the adult books, but definitely going down into the younger age range when you're writing? How much does who you think is going to be reading this come into play?
I think of that much more writing for young readers, because there is a sense of these books are going to, a book can change lives and can really, really, I mean, of course a book can change lives for adults, but that time of firsts when you're young, I feel a certain responsibility about, what's in it in a way, whereas the rest of you are on your own with my books. But I think about it more definitely with books for young readers. For me, as writing adult fiction, I always feel when I say adult fiction, it sounds like I'm talking about porn. My adult fiction, I feel like I am, in a sense, a version. I want to write the book that I want to find on the shelf. And maybe I'm not such a freak that there are readers who share certain kinds of tastes that I have. That's sort of how I see it.
Speaking of younger readers, I probably should have run this by you backstage because I hope it's something. But I was personally very curious about this when I noticed today you're tweeting about the event and your display picture on Twitter is an illustration of Harriet the Spy.
Yes.
I have a real fondness for Harriet the Spy.
Right.
I discovered her through the Nickelodeon adaptation in the 90s.
Wow.
And used to put on like a raincoat, and I found like these tiny binoculars, and I used to spy on my grandparents with them. And I'm curious to know what Harriet means to you.
Oh my God, I love that you discovered her through, I feel so old. I discovered her through the cave painting. There was like a little cave painting of her with her diary. Okay, so the books I read when I was young, I mean, I remember them all. And Harriet the Spy was just, she got in trouble for writing. right? Which I think is something we can all aspire to. And I just loved that book so much. And the idea of, you know, writing boldly and writing, there's that line, write as if everyone you knew were dead. The idea of just this girl writing, I picture myself being young in my room writing away. I didn't, you know, and my diary and the whole thing. So, yeah, and I love those drawings of her too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I interviewed Alison Bechdel a few years ago,
yeah.
and she was like, I have an affinity. I thought I wanted to be Harriet. Like, she was obsessed with
Yeah.
her as well. I feel like it's a real common thread.
Definitely,
Like,
yeah. She was free in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
The freedom of writing what you feel like is something that, you know, that I wanted to do for so long. So, yeah, there's a question.
Clearly your passion comes through from an early age as a child. But, you know, then there's the daily grind. And I'm wondering if you could share something about the routine and the discipline of writing over 3 years to produce one book.
Yeah, that really brought me down. How was Australia, Meg? Well, I'm teasing you. It's a very good question. Thank you. It's not easy. It is really a grind. It is absolutely the word for it. There's different kinds of writing. Just as the sort of like the famous feminists and everyone else, there's the days when you're really cooking, and there's the days when you really have to kind of remake it again from the start, and you sort of, you know, pull all the stitches that you were doing the other day. I guess I feel like one of the things that can help is to read something where you feel a published book where you feel the writer was excited when he or she wrote that passage. It's about reconnecting with the kind of love that you feel. It's extremely hard. It's like when I finish a book, I feel like I need to go to sleep, like I've had a seizure or something. It's so long. I look at this book, it's like, I can't believe I wrote it. Like, I can't, you know, one of the nice things about writing a book with another person is it's sort of like self-rising yeast. You go to bed and you wake up in the morning and there's like more of the book. That did not happen with this book or the Interestings, which is a really long book, and this is pretty long. The Wife was a short book, but in every case, it's all on you. And I sometimes lie awake in bed, like horrified, like I have to get up the next day. I feel sometimes like, you know, like those little hobo bindle, you know, those little hobo sticks. I'm just carrying my novel down the side of a road, you know, like a sandwich, inside a handkerchief on a stick. That's me for 3 years. Boom, boom.
The neighbors watch you go, and they're like, there she is again.
There she is again. That's really what it's like. It's not glamorous, which is why my son thought I should be a line cook at McDonald's. You know, it's not. It really, you know, and also there's so many chances to be sort of humiliated. I mean, if you write a novel called The Interestings, believe me, on Amazon, someone is going to put as their review, not very, you know, or on Amazon, I might add, you know, somebody writes, this book arrived ripped, 1 star. I was like, you can't really win. And also, another thing too, it's like you go somewhere and you meet someone who hears you're a writer, and they ask you often the worst question. Don't ever ask a writer, this is the worst question you ask a writer. They ask a writer, would I have heard of you? And really, for a long time, I would like name my books, and they're sort of completely not recognizing any of them, and then they say, no, I only read vampire fiction. But I finally came up with a good answer that if you're a writer, you can say. If somebody says, would I have heard of you? A writer ought to say, in a more just world. So I hope to live in that more just world. But I think that, no, you're absolutely right. Most of writing is not the thrilling moments, like seriously coming to this place, to Melbourne, and speaking to all of you wonderful people. I mean, it isn't that. This is the wonderful stuff that happens afterward. But during it, you can have a wonderful moment when you come up with an image that you like. But it's all on you, and you have to sort of like being by yourself, and you have to feel okay with days that don't go well. I often just try not to I try not to beat up on myself, but to go out and do something physical and then go back, or read and then go back to it. But every novel is made up of a lot of small moments, bad days and good days, and then somehow you get there. So
I think that brings us to the end of our time together, sadly. Thank you so much, Meg.
Thank
Please
you
join me.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.